17. Congruity. Normally, there is a congruity of character in men and cultures. The several aspects of a person's or a culture's nature will be in an essential agreement or harmony. Thus, if a man is a rapist or a murderer, he is likely also to be a liar. If a culture is prone to violence and theft, it will also be prone to rape and murder. James, in his epistle, refers to this congruity, declaring, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. For he that said, Do not commit adultery, said also, Do not kill. Now, if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou art become a transgressor of the law." James chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Doth a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries? Either a vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt, water, and fresh? James chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. James stresses two things here. First, in James chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, James tells us that because the whole law comes from God and because it expresses his nature, to break the law at any one point is to express rebellion against God and against his law. The law of God is a unity, and he who despises God at one point has expressed contempt for God at all points. Thus, he is guilty of all. Second, there is a unity in man also. Man is not a collection of random wills, but is a person, a creature with a particular nature and bent. No more than a fountain can flow with both salt, water, and fresh, can a man be at peace with God while breaking God's law. Again, each kind of fruit tree bears a particular kind of fruit, so that a grapevine does not produce figs. Similarly, no lawless man manifests a love of God and his law. Applied to the matter of sovereignty, this fact has very important implications. If sovereignty has its locale in man, then morality and law will, to all practical intent, originate in man. There will be a natural congruity in those things. Similarly, if sovereignty belongs to man, then wisdom will also originate in man. Thus, because Louis XIV saw himself as the sovereign power, his attitude towards God was one of treaty, not humility. After one decisive defeat, Louis said, "God seems to have forgotten all I have done for him." Louis spoke of the purity of my intentions. At other times, he did speak of having merited God's punishments. Kendall noted of Louis XI, "He asked neither for grace nor for salvation, merely for the prolongation of his life." The English Tudors and Stuarts were equally arrogant, if not more so. They were, after all, sovereigns. Their sovereignty, to them, meant that they were also endowed with wisdom and virtue, and hence they were unforgiving of the real or imagined errors of all subordinates, while oblivious to their own greater lapses. When sovereignty was seized by the middle-class leaders of the French Revolution, this same congruity in their pretensions was apparent. Robespierre saw himself as the voice of wisdom and virtue. In all revolutions, this same megalomania has been apparent. As sovereignty has descended downward to the common man or the worker, so too has the arrogance and megalomania. Not only has sovereignty moved theoretically and sometimes actually downward, so too has megalomania. The human wielders of sovereignty have a deep suspicion of all other people. Thus, the Stockton Record carried a long editorial on March the 23rd, 1988, charging a third-grade state textbook with racism because someone had protested a statement with respect to Martin Luther King Jr., that is, that he had been killed, whereas the protester and the newspaper insisted it should have read assassinated. Someone objected to this nonsense, writing, "In reference to your editorial on March the 23rd, as long as you and others of similar mindsets can find racism in a third-grade school worksheet that uses the word killed instead of the word assassinated, we're going to travel down the road of racial conflict in America a long, long time. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, but how many third-grade school children know the meaning of the word? Any reasonable, observant adult can readily understand that the paragraph that you quoted was couched in a language the child could understand. It was not written to adult readers, nor to those who are overly sensitive to any racial overtones, whether real or imaginary." Sturtevant's letter was logical and sensible, but both logic and sense are attributes lacking where men fawn over a human power centre. Men in Louis XIV's day vied for the privilege of taking care of the king's chamber pot when he needed to urinate or defecate. In the same way, men today are ready to be the chamber pot bearers for the workers and whatever minority group, racial or sexual, is making demands. On Easter Sunday, April 3rd, 1988, the Stockton Record, using the syndicated story of the Los Angeles Times, had a front-page story, not on the resurrected Christ and Easter, but on Martin Luther King Jr., in which the readers were told, "He resurrected a society," said Washington lawyer Charles Morgan, the first white man to serve as director of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. "No one else did that. No one except Roosevelt." At the same time, others championed other sovereigns. Thus, Angus White, a professor of environmental studies at California State University, Sacramento, California, charged that many Mexicans go hungry and are exploited so Americans can have vegetables on the table all year. The Mexican government subsidized improved farming, but the growers decided there were more profits in selling to the US. Unsafe spraying of vegetables, White said, is responsible for endangering the lives of Mexican workers, and this too he saw as a fault of the US. White said nothing about the eagerness of Mexico to sell to the US, nor that the US has repeatedly protested the heavy and dangerous use of pesticides by Mexican growers. Because sovereignty has drifted downward to the people, all power and virtue belong to the people also. If between the US and any smaller country a problem exists, the virtue belongs to the smaller country and the sin to the US. The same is true in racial matters. The sin belongs to the white man and the virtue to the others. Of course, a century ago, before the drift from kings to the lower depths of society had gone this far, the white man was seen as a locale of virtue and other races the source of vices. It was then believed that the darker the skin, the less the virtue. Now this former truism has been reversed. As a result, in the Western world, lower-class whites are resentful against other races because of the legal favoritism to them. We can say that racial antagonism is a modern phenomenon. It did not exist prior to the rise of humanism, because as long as religions which pointed beyond man dominated societies, tensions were religious, not racial. The Jews experienced, prior to the modern era, both antipathy and a regard alike based on religious grounds. Racial hostility is basic to cultures which centre on man, because human factors are then central to society. The rise of the homosexual rights movement has meant some resentment by blacks in America. For them, their displacement from the centre of concern by the homosexual cause is a matter of resentment. Sovereignty, however, having been separated from God by modern thought, moves downward, and it carries with it other things as well, wisdom and virtue among them. It is thus usually impossible to get militant, logical humanists to admit that homosexuality is a sin and evil, because for them, virtue and wisdom attach themselves to the downward drift of the centre of society. The Congruity of Life's movement requires these men at the same time to vindicate the newest centre of that downward drift. They cry of, "All power to the people," began with humanism and with the divine right of kings. Rulers like those who wear the British crown are figureheads. The real rulers are in the slums of London, Glasgow, and other cities. Carl Sandburg said, "The people, yes, and the modern state is increasingly defying the people downward." Christians are at best only marginally the people. In some states, they are the enemies of the people. This designation should not surprise us. Christians, by affirming the sovereignty of the triune God and the universal kingship of Jesus Christ, thereby deny the modern doctrines of sovereignty and the people. The fact that most Christians are unaware of the conflict does not alter the fact that the humanists recognize that Christ's lordship spells death to the modern state because it undercuts its premise. Christians speak of natural man, meaning fallen man, the man who is now all around us since the fall. The term witnesses to the fact of human depravity outside of Christ. The Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 6, says, 2. By this sin they fell from their original righteousness and communion with God, and so became dead in sin and wholly defiled in all the faculties and parts of soul and body. They being the root of all mankind, the guilt of this sin was imputed, and the same death in sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity, descending from them by ordinary generation. From this original corruption, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions. In the modern era, however, as a result of the trends which culminated in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the term natural man means the naturally good humanity whose corruption stems from civilization. Somehow this natural man exists and can be freed from evil by means of revolution. However, as Fosco Marianini has pointed out, there is no such thing as natural man. There is only cultural man. We must thus say that the modern idea of natural man is a myth. There is only cultural man. The culture of modern man is what Cornelius van Til has described as integration into the void. This is what we are witnessing. In recent years, various groups of humanists have fought in and out of the courts for animal rights, the rights of trees and so on, seeking to get the approval of the courts for a legal standing in court of trees, animals, and in one case of rocks. Whereas at first it was the white man who was sovereign, now, if these groups succeed, it will not be man at all. Rocks and guppies may displace the homosexuals. The logic of modern man's doctrine leads to this integration downward into the void. the only valid alternative is the sovereignty of God.